right, folks, we're going to move on to our keynote lecture for this summit here. Our speaker is, of course, Rod Dreher. He is editor-at-large at the American Conservative, where he was a senior editor for 12 years. He's a veteran of 3 decades of magazine and newspaper journalism and has written 3 New York Times bestsellers, which are Live Not by Lies, The Benedict Option, and The Little Way of Ruthie Lemming. He currently works for the Danube Institute and lives in Budapest, Hungary. Please join me in welcoming Rod Dreher.
It's so strange to have to take out your laptop and get your speech there, but this is what technology does for us. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be back in Texas. I lived here in Dallas from 2003 to early 2010, and you know, there's a lot of good things to be said about Budapest, but they ain't got no enchiladas there, and it was margarita o'clock at noon on Friday, so God bless Texas. So about 10 years ago, a few months after the Obergefell decision legalizing same-sex marriage came down from the Supreme Court, I attended a private invitation-only gathering of Christian leaders up in Connecticut. I had been invited to talk about my idea of the Benedict Option, the concept that in a post-Christian society, small O Orthodox Christians need to form cohesive communities of believers as a way of maintaining the faith in the face of an increasingly hostile culture. Well, the other speaker invited to address the group was a professor whose expertise is in the sociology of the family. He addressed the elephant in the room, the Obergefell effect. Everybody in that room was a Christian social conservative, and he assured us that we had all suffered a significant loss with the Obergefell ruling. But, he said, that's not the biggest thing, that is not remotely the biggest thing. The biggest thing will be if we lose the gender binary. Even same-sex marriage, he said, operates within the gender binary, but if transgenderism becomes normalized in our culture, then it's over for our civilization. Now, he didn't explain that bold claim that it would be over for civilization if transgenderism becomes normal. And incredible as it is to me to think about it now, none of us asked him to. I guess that the idea of transgenderism becoming normalized seemed so remote, this idea that we would lose the gender binary, that none of us cared to speculate. Sure, we all knew that the transgender fight was coming, but we all thought we had maybe 3 or 4 years to get ready. We didn't even have 3 or 4 months. When I saw the cover story of Time magazine shortly after that pronouncing, quote, the transgender moment, I picked up the phone and called that professor and reminded him of his warning to us and asked him, so what should we do now? Honestly, he said, take the Benedict option. Well, his point was, and it was a serious point, was that we all have to create resilient communities within which fundamental biological and moral realities can be remembered throughout this collective period of insanity. Well, I'm not here tonight to talk about the Benedict option and gender ideology. I am here, though, to talk about how and why we should mount a strong resistance to its triumph, even if, like that professor, we doubt the likelihood of success, at least in the short term. This evening, I will tell you why I think gender ideology is at the core of a new kind of totalitarianism that has taken over nearly all of the institutions in Western civilization. And drawing on the experiences of dissidents who resisted Soviet communism during the Cold War, I'll tell you why I think we have no choice but to fight and how we should carry out that fight of resistance. First, let's talk about totalitarianism. It's a very big word, a word that we who are older and who lived through the Cold War, it's just like this massive word that could be spelled out in iron. We associate that word with George Orwell's 1984 and with the grim police states that the that was the Soviet Union and its empire. But totalitarianism does not have to be oppressive in precisely that way. In its most basic form, totalitarianism is an extreme form of authoritarianism. Generally speaking, in an authoritarian society, the state monopolizes political power behind one leader or a common ideology. Aspects of life that occur outside of the political realm, those things don't matter to the state. Totalitarianism, on the other hand, is authoritarianism that regards all of life as political. Therefore, totalitarians try to control all of reality. Nothing can be said to exist outside of the ideology undergirding totalitarianism. In a totalitarian society, everything must be subject to the ruling ideology. This is why in the Soviet Union, I'm not making this up, the government actually tried, I believe it was in the 30s, to reverse the course of rivers. Not just to divert the course, but to reverse them, to make rivers run backwards. The state finally gave up, but the fact that they even believed such a thing was possible tells you something about the totalitarian mindset. In the same way, they tried any number of cruel schemes to engineer human nature, to create what they called Soviet man. And they also thought they could command the economy to do anything that the central planners wanted. Well, of course, it all fell apart because all the money and the forceful application of human will in the world cannot ultimately defeat reality. The United States, by the way, discovered the same thing in the deserts of Iraq and in Afghanistan in this century. But in the case of the Soviet Union and Soviet totalitarianism, it took 70 years to collapse at the cost of 100 million dead and untold human misery. Well, in 2015, around the same time that I was at that clandestine Christian meeting in Connecticut, I began hearing from people in America who had escaped from the communist world to come to the United States seeking freedom. They began telling me that they were now seeing the same kinds of things emerging here in America that they had left behind in the communist world. They were seeing people being bullied into silence or into saying things they believed were false. They were seeing people lose their businesses or forced out of their jobs for disagreeing with an ideological line. In fact, I got a call one day from, this is what started my interest in this project, got a call one day from a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic. And the guy was the incoming head of the Catholic Medical Association of the whole country. He told me that his mother, who was elderly and lived with him and his wife, had earlier in her life been a political prisoner in Czechoslovakia in the 50s. The communist government, imprisoned her as a Vatican spy because she refused to stop going to Mass. They tortured her, kept her in prison for 6 years, tortured her, and just made her life hell. When she got out of jail, she came to America, married his father, and that was her life. But there she was in 2015, living with her son and his wife, saying, "Son, the things I see happening now in America remind me of what it was like in my home country when communism first came." And I thought that was crazy, really. My mom is old. She watches a lot of Fox News and chain smokes Marlboros and worries about we and Revelations. But, it's not real. Turns out it was real. The more people I talked to who came from the Soviet world, and you'd really talk to them and not argue with them, say, tell me more, I realized they were seeing something that the rest of us just couldn't see. And it actually kind of confused them too, because America doesn't have secret police. We don't have a network of prison camps called the Gulag Archipelago in Solzhenitsyn's phrase. We don't have agents torturing the Winston Smiths of America, forcing them to confess that they love Big Brother. Nevertheless, these people could not deny that what they felt in their bones, that America was actually making a totalitarian turn. And if you talk to these people long enough, they would express their deep anger at Americans for not taking their warnings seriously. Well, as I said, they were right. The more I talked to them and investigated what they claimed, I saw they were really onto something. What they didn't understand, and what I came to understand, was that totalitarianism does not have to come about through, quote unquote, hard methods, the sort of thing you see in Orwell's 1984. It can be soft, like what Aldous Huxley writes about in his dystopian novel, Brave New World. Now, most of us read 1984 in high school or certainly in college, but many fewer of us have read Brave New World. Brave New World is actually the dystopian novel from the 20th century that more accurately describes the totalitarianism we're living through now. If you haven't read it, you really should. It is, as I said, a good guide to the world that's coming into being right now. In that novel, Brave New World, the totalitarian world government maintains control over people not by harsh Soviet-style police state means. Rather, it controls people by giving them everything they want. It takes care of all their material needs. It gives them feel-good drugs and all the sex and porn that they want. It keeps them entertained constantly. The totalitarianism of Brave New World is what you might call therapeutic. The state maintains its control by alleviating all suffering, and you don't dare stand up against the state, because if you did that, then you might have to suffer. And you wouldn't be happy. The only cost of all this is your liberty, and not just your liberty, but your humanity. Well, back in 2019, when I was in Budapest, capital of Hungary, researching my book, Live Not by Lies, my interpreter told me a story as we rode the tram. Anna was and is a Hungarian woman. At that time, in her early 30s, she was married, the mother of a child, a political conservative, and a practicing Catholic. Anna complained to me that she had so much trouble talking to friends of her generation, even her Catholic friends, about ordinary life. She said that as soon as she will say something like, well, my husband and I have been arguing lately, or our little boy is really misbehaving and we don't know what to do, her friends will cut her off and tell her, hey, you should divorce your husband. You should put your son in daycare. Go back to work. You have a right to be happy. She told me, I tell them, wait a minute, I am happy. I love being married. I love being a mom. But a happy life is not the same thing as a life without stress. But they just don't get it. I said to her, Anna, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. That's it, she said. Where did you get that idea? Well, it comes from chapter 17 of Brave New World. That's a chapter where John the Savage, a social outcast, confronts Mustafa Mond, the world controller for Europe. Mond has no intention of torturing him. He just simply can't figure out why anybody would want to live outside of a society where everyone is happy. And all suffering and anxiety have been eliminated through technology and the application of technology and drugs. Well, John the Savage tells him that you can't be fully human without accepting the possibility of suffering and allowing it to shape your character. Joy, says John, is not possible without the possibility of sorrow. Pleasure means nothing without the possibility of pain. And sanctity cannot be understood without the opportunity to sin. Well, Mustafa Mond, the world controller, he can't understand any of this. He says to John, it sounds like you're fighting for your right to be unhappy. Well, yeah, declares John, I am. Well, says Mond, you're welcome to it. This, friends, is the essence of the soft totalitarianism that is overtaking us today. In general, people in our civilization are surrendering their liberties for the sake of having their anxieties alleviated by authorities. Specifically, we are all compelled to live by lies for the sake of soothing not only our collective anxiety, but especially the anxiety of minorities favored by power-holding institutional elites. There's a second aspect to soft totalitarianism, its methods. Hard totalitarianism is when the secret police throw you in jail for saying something that offends the government. Soft totalitarianism, by contrast, is what happens in an apparently free society when you lose your job, or have your business shut down, or are canceled for saying something that offends against the ruling ideology. And it's not necessarily the government that does this. In fact, it's usually not the government that does this, but it's supporters of this ideology in private institutions, this ideology that rules the hearts and minds of a significant group of people in the ruling class. This is how soft totalitarianism works, even in a society that remains free, at least on paper. Nobody's going to send you to jail for what you say, but they can still exact harsh enough penalties on you to cause you to police your own words, your own conduct, and even your own thoughts. The means are different, but the totalitarian outcome is much the same. There's a story that occurred to me, it happened to me in Budapest when I got there in summer of 2021, when I wanted to meet somebody who was opposed to the government of Viktor Orban, the prime minister. It's a right-wing figure, much hated by the left. So I went to see this one professor who was, I think he taught politics or something, but anyway, he was one of the top public intellectuals who opposed Orban and was very well respected. I sat down with him and said, tell me why you're opposed to the government. He said, well, it's the corruption. I'm against the corruption. Okay. He said, and I'm a liberal. I'm in favor of same-sex marriage and same-sex adoption. Our government opposes that. Got it. But on the trans issue, he said, I'm just not sure what I think. Then he goes on with his discourse. At the end of his discourse, he said, but you know, I can stand up in my classroom here in Budapest, say anything I want about the government, and nobody will say anything to me. I'm free to do that. And I said, Peter, you know, in America, you could do the same thing. You could say anything you want. The government won't come after you. But if you did something like you did at the beginning of our interview, where you said you weren't sure what you thought about transgenderism, you know, there might well be students in your class who would be offended by that. Go to the authorities in your university, tell them you made them feel unsafe. You would be hauled before a star chamber of your colleagues, put through the mill, and you may lose your job as a teacher. And if that happened to you, you would never teach in America again because you would have the scarlet letter of being a transphobe. So, I said to him, who has more freedom, in fact? You here in Orban's Hungary, or a liberal professor like you in America who had the same opinions as you, but who was unwise enough to say out loud that you didn't know what you believed about transgenderism? It had not occurred to him. He had no idea this was happening in America. This is soft totalitarianism, but it's something we don't see because our idea of totalitarianism always involves the police state government. Now, there is no more absurd example of soft totalitarianism than the codes, both written and unwritten, around gender ideology. Can there be a more false claim than that a biological man can be a biological woman and vice versa, or a man can be a woman and vice versa? Yet this is where we are. This ideology has taken over every major institution of American life, including the intelligence agencies and the U.S. Armed Forces. Now, it would be pointless to stand here and list all the examples where this has happened, or even the most meaningful instances of its manifesting. We'd be here all night. I'll give this one instance to stand for the whole because it's so important. Now, you might have heard about WPATH, W-P-A-T-H, the international private organization whose standards govern transgender health care. Our medical institutions have completely given themselves over to WPATH to set policy. And yet, there was a massive expose a month ago by independent journalists, Michael Schellenberger and others, who worked from leaked internal files from WPATH that revealed WPATH operates not at all according to scientific standards, but rather ideological standards. They knowingly lie about these things, consciously, on purpose, with catastrophic and irreversible consequences for young people. It was a stunning piece of investigative work, and I advise you, when you leave here tonight, go look it up, WPATH expose, because you probably haven't heard of it. Why not? Because the mainstream media have ignored it, because it doesn't conform to the progressive narrative that our media prefer. The thing you have to realize about establishment journalism today, and I say this as someone who's been in it for 35 years, its practitioners believe it is more important to manage the narrative than to report the news. It's more important to manage the narrative than to report the news. The prime directive for covering the culture war is the religious right must lose no matter how many lies you have to tell to achieve victory. Gender ideology is the most egregious example of soft totalitarianism's effort to control reality. One of the most important ways the totalitarians do this is by controlling language. It is a fundamental belief of the woke theoreticians that language creates reality. In Orwell's 1984, the author tells us that under the dictatorship of Big Brother, the party understands that by changing language, it controls the categories that shape how people think. What the party calls freedom is slavery. What the party calls truth is a lie, and so forth. What it calls doublethink, holding two contradictory ideas in one's mind simultaneously and accepting both of them, that's how people learn to submit their minds to the party's ideology. If the party says 2 + 2 = 5, then 2 + 2 = 5. The goal is to convince the person that all truth exists within the mind, and the rightly ordered mind believes whatever the party says is true. Let me repeat that. All truth exists within the mind, not externally, not as a matter of objective fact. It all exists within the mind, and the rightly ordered mind believes whatever the party says is true. Orwell writes, this is a quote, "It was as though some huge force were pressing down upon you, something that penetrated inside your skull, battering against your brain, frightening you out of your beliefs, persuading you almost to deny the evidence of your senses. In the end, the party would announce that 2 and 2 made 5, and you would have to believe it. It was inevitable that they should make that claim sooner or later. The logic of their position demanded it. Not merely the validity of experience, but the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. The heresy of heresies was common sense," unquote. Well, to update an Orwell line to our own situation, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. Orwell teaches us that those who control language control the tools we have to conceptualize reality. Now, words don't create reality in the fundamental sense, but they do have a psychological effect that has a lot to do with our ability to perceive the world as it is. In Warsaw, I interviewed a leading Polish historian, Paweł Skibinski, who told me that the people of his generation, the last one to come of age under communism, worry a lot about the ability of the post-communist generations to understand the nature of this new totalitarianism that is sweeping over all of us. And it has to do with language. Professor Skibinski focuses on language as a preserver of cultural memory. He said that today we are repeating the Marxist habit of falsifying language, hollowing out familiar words and replacing them with a new, highly ideological meaning. Assigned female at birth, for example. Propaganda not only changes the way we think about politics and contemporary life, but it also conditions what a culture judges as worth remembering. The soft totalitarians within woke institutions imbue some words and phrases with negative connotations, and they make other words and phrases compulsory. This is so familiar to people like Professor Skibinski, who grew up under communism. He told me, quote, "The people who lived only within such a linguistic sphere, who didn't know any other way to speak, they could really start believing in this way of using words. If a word carries with it negative baggage, it becomes impossible to have a discussion about the phenomenon," unquote. Now here's something else interesting he told me, that teaching college students who grew up in the post-communist era is challenging because they don't have a natural immunity to the ideological abuse of language. He said, quote, "For me, it's obvious. I remember the false use of language. But for our students, it's impossible to understand." Now, do you all see why it's so important to refuse to use the language of totalitarians? Every time we normalize their terminology and way of talking, every time we use preferred pronouns and jargon, cisgender, things like that, we surrender more and more of our hold on reality. We make it harder to see the world as it actually is. So how do people keep hold of reality under these communist totalitarian conditions? How did they know not only what to remember, but how to remember it? The answer I found in talking to people who lived this, who had to try to survive it, was to create distinct, small communities, especially families, communities of families, and religious fellowships in which it was possible both to speak truthfully and to live out truth in your body. Professor Skibinski told me, quote, "They had social spaces where the real meaning of words was preserved, For me," he said, "it's less important to argue with such a view of the world," he's talking about progressivism, "than to describe reality as it is. For example, our task is to show people what a normal monogamous family looks like," unquote. Now look, there's powerful wisdom in that for you young people who are preparing for professional life and for being one day husbands and wives, fathers and mothers. You're really cursed in a sense to be coming of age in a time when our civilization has lost its mind. It has gone insane on nothing more consequential to your future and the future of our civilization than sex and gender. We are talking about nothing less than guaranteeing a future for humanity. Many of the people who are indoctrinated by gender ideology, even if they don't succumb to it themselves by seeking to transition or declaring themselves genderqueer, gender fluid, they're still not going to be able to form stable relationships, form solid families, and raise children who are able to flourish. And as Professor Skibinski says, it's less important to win an argument with these gender ideologues as it is to keep your own eyes clearly focused on reality. And not only to see reality clearly, but to live it out in your own lives, in your own families and communities. To paraphrase Orwell, you carry on the human heritage not by winning an argument, but by keeping yourself grounded in reality. So how do we bear witness to the truth of the gender binary, or the maleness of maleness and the femaleness of femaleness? Well, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the greatest anti-communist dissident of the 20th century, had a fundamental command: live not by lies. Live not by lies. His point was that we might not have the power to change the system under which we live. Solzhenitsyn said, he said this in 1974, just before he was exiled from the Soviet Union. He said, none of us can run out in Red Square and denounce the government. They'll haul us off. It won't do any good. But what we all can do is refuse to capitulate to the system of lies and to live by the lies that keep the system held up. He said our enemies and the enemies of truth might have too much power for us to stand up to them directly. But that does not excuse us from behaving morally in the face of the lies that the system depends on for its existence. Hard totalitarianism, said Solzhenitsyn, depends on the use of force police force usually, to compel obedience. But totalitarianism often can count on softer methods. Often, said Solzhenitsyn, it only expects people to pledge allegiance to the lie, just to say you agree with it. He wrote, quote, "And the simple act of an ordinary brave man is to not participate in the lie, not to support false actions. His rule, let the lie come into the world and even reign supreme, but not through me." Listen to that rule again. Let the lie come into the world and even reign supreme, but not through me. What does it mean to live not by lies? Simply this, according to Solzhenitsyn. If you find yourself in a situation when you can't say what you believe is true, leave if you can. Do not participate in events where you can't question what is said and where your presence lends implicit support to the lie. You don't even have to explicitly denounce a lie, but at the very least, you must not be afraid to withhold your consent. I'll give you an example. Last month at UCLA Medical School, I say last month, but this was like almost 10 days ago, a lunatic diversity speaker came to address a mandatory class on structural racism. Somebody in the room leaked audio of the event to the newspaper Washington Free Beacon. The speaker chanted extremely provocative woke slogans and ordered the students to stand up, get on the ground, and pray to, quote, Mama Earth, and more. I mean, it was bonkers. When she told the students to stand up to enact some other ritual, one student, a lone student, remained seated. A UCLA administrator on the audio is heard asking for the identity of that student who refused to stand, implying that he could face disciplinary action. Now, that young man, whose name we don't know, exemplifies what Solzhenitsyn was talking about. He refused to live by lies. He didn't stand up and denounce it. He just didn't stand up. And for that, he was a hero. But notice, he might have to pay a price for it. He might be disciplined for it. And this is the other big lesson I learned from the anti-communist dissidents. You have to be prepared to suffer. You have to be prepared to suffer for the truth. Solzhenitsyn put it like this in one of his speeches, quote, "To defend oneself, one must also be ready to die. But there is such little readiness in a society reared on the cult of earthly well-being." You know, just before I was born, the civil rights movement in the U.S. was going at full strength. Those brave men and women were willing to risk their freedom and risk their own lives to stand up for the truth. They were willing to suffer nonviolently for what they believed was true. And they did this. It's not a coincidence that the civil rights movement in this country was led by pastors, by Christians, because they believe they answer to a higher authority. That is the kind of thing that we're all going to have to be willing to suffer if we're going to stand up to these lies. Only by being willing to make a sacrifice do our convictions become real. Some people living under communism thought that they could avoid trouble by staying silent, just staying out of it, keep your head down, don't cause trouble. The problem with this, though, is that you have to make lots of psychological compromises to stifle your internal dissent. And you get used to wearing a mask in public. Eventually, if you're not careful, that mask that you wear to protect yourself becomes your true face. So what happens if the big lie of gender ideology triumphs? It cannot triumph in the end permanently because it's based on unreality. But, as the history of Soviet communism proves, there is a lot of ruin in the lie that has taken over a society's institutions and its ruling class. A lot of suffering and destruction can happen before the lie fails. So what are the consequences of failing to resist this particular lie, this lie that says that we can choose our own gender and that gender is totally fluid, the gender binary does not exist? Well, first we have to understand that gender ideology is a paradigmatic lie of the totalitarianism that arose out of the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution triumphed in large part because post-war American culture had already accepted that liberty is to be found in freeing the individual from unchosen constraints. So the sexual revolution, which Philip Reeve said was actually a more consequential revolution than the Bolshevik Revolution, that was a variation on this liberation of the individual. The sexual revolution claimed that sexual desire, sexual identity is at the core of human personhood, and that one's personal liberation depends on maximizing individual sexual freedom. Now, it's only a slight shift to claim that the right to sleep with whoever you want to define your sexual identity according to your own desires, naturally leads to be able to define your sex itself according to your personal desire. This is insane, of course, and it will radically hamper our abilities to form relationships, stable relationships and families. Even if none of your children ever succumb to transgenderism, they cannot avoid living in a society and in a culture in which gender nonconformity is at least a possibility for them. And this will add greatly to their anxiety as they are growing into sexual maturity. We're seeing this now, especially among young women whose levels of anxiety and emotional instability are off the charts. We're making it far worse for them by leading them to believe that denying their biology will improve their lives. Here's a true story. A couple of years ago, I was in the country of Slovenia on a book tour. My translator, a Catholic father, told me about his daughter, who was at the time 11 years old. Now, Slovenia is a nice, tranquil, Central European country where nothing interesting ever happens. This is why the man and his wife felt safe in giving their daughter a smartphone for her 11th birthday so she could keep up with her school friends in town. Well, it was a disaster. This poor girl somehow made contact with teenagers in America, in Oregon, for example, in fact. These teenagers convinced that girl that she had better choose her gender before puberty chooses it for her. This child fell into such a deep depression that she couldn't eat and she couldn't go to school. Now, that family did not live in a society where gender ideology was even conceivable. But the internet has obliterated borders in ways that they simply could not grasp. Last year, I was back in Slovenia and ran into that father again at an event. I asked him how his daughter was doing. She's 13 now. Still identifies as female, but it's shaky. And she's hooked on drugs, he said. But her parents still have not taken away her smartphone. Well, today we're in a situation like that described by Yeats in his poem, The Second Coming. The best sort of people, the people who know best, who have their knowledge anchored in reality, lack faith in their own convictions about right and wrong, and what's real and what's fake. But the worst sort of people are filled with passionate intensity of the kind that has driven gender ideology from strength to strength. But the danger from the totalitarianism of gender ideology is even more fundamental than I've said so far, in ways that don't have to do with sexual identity. To accept the claims of gender ideology is to accept a particular view about what a human being is. It is to say that human nature is plastic, that human nature is malleable, that we are only really free insofar as we can exercise total control over our own bodies, over ourselves. Freedom is not to be found in learning how to change the things we can that ought to be changed and to live in harmony with given limits. No, freedom is about denying that there is any such thing as human nature, that there are any such thing as natural limits. It's about asserting that we have a right and a duty to mold our bodies to shape who we want to be. This is why transgenderism, why gender ideology is the bridge to the transhuman future that Silicon Valley elites especially want for humanity. They believe that the human person is entirely material, and therefore infinitely manipulable. The transhumanists seek the elimination of suffering through establishing, via technology, godlike control over one's biological processes, over one's moods, and over one's emotions. And their ultimate goal is creating immortality. To achieve this requires the elimination of every limitation that humans experience. It is to engineer human bodies and human souls, though they don't believe in souls, so that we all have a friction-free, entirely liquid, entirely flowing existence. The goal is to, by establishing complete control, eliminate anxiety and resistance, and to abolish any sense of givenness and any sense of natural borders and natural limits. In the end, if you think about it, it is to reverse the Christian doctrine of the fall and to achieve life everlasting. Well, you see what this is, don't you? It is a utopian religion. It's what Mustafa Mann, the world controller for Europe in Brave New World, calls, quote, Christianity without tears. This can only be achieved when you abolish man, when you destroy human nature. And that is where Western civilization is going with accelerating speed. Now, many of you might not have made the connection between gender ideology and this kind of radical, apocalyptic dystopianism, but it's there. It's not because gender ideology inevitably leads to these horrible things. Rather, it's because the things that you have to affirm about human nature in order to normalize gender ideology leaves you with no defense at all against transhumanism. So let's end tonight by going back to the professor's 2015 warning that if we lose the gender binary, we're going to lose our civilization. Since then, and especially as transgenderism has really taken over our culture, I've tried to contact that professor several times to ask him to explain what he meant. He's pretty much gone underground. Now, I've spoken to other people who were in the room with him that day and who have tried to reconnect with the man since then. He won't answer their phone calls or emails. I should add that in 2015, on that day, that poor man burst into tears when he began to lecture us. He apologized, saying it had been maybe the worst week of his life. The FBI had arrested 2 people that week who had been making death threats against him over his critical stance on gender ideology. These 2 were a pair of former grad students of his who were close to him, but they were so devoted to gender ideology that they threatened to blow his head off, and the FBI arrested them. Well, just today, before I came here tonight, I looked that professor up online. He's still teaching, but I think that this scholar, an older man, a very gentle soul, effectively went underground out of fear. But I really just don't know. My best guess, though, is that the professor understood, when I try to explain what he meant by saying we'll lose our civilization, my best guess is that he understood that if we collectively abolish the gender binary in the minds of our people, then we not only have no protection against transhumanism, but we also can be persuaded to believe anything at all. We will have arrived at the same situation described by Orwell in 1984, that the very existence of external reality was tacitly denied by their philosophy. Again, if you can believe the gender binary is not real when it's the most obvious thing to any observer of biological reality among humans and in the animal kingdom, then you can be made to believe anything. Those who accept gender ideology, even well-meaning parents who accept the lie that they have to choose between a live trans child or a dead cisgendered one, they're already denying the very existence of external reality. They demand that we all deny this reality, and they will tell any lie they need to and engage in any bullying they have to do to force every one of us to comply. If the self-appointed engineers of human nature succeed in forcing this lie on all of us, on what grounds will any of us take a stand against what they demand next? Solzhenitsyn once said, quote, "Today's world has reached a stage that, had it been described to preceding centuries, would have called forth the unanimous cry, This is the apocalypse. Yet we've grown used to this kind of world. We even feel at home in it, close quote. Don't you think that's true? Because of your age, you can't possibly know how fast everything has fallen apart. Well, let me give you some idea. 20 years ago, the discussion about the legalization of same-sex marriage got underway in earnest. Now, if you had said in 2004, and I know this, I was an editorial page writer and editor at the Dallas Morning News in 2004, if you had said back then that by 2024, in 20 years, we would have forgotten in law and culture what it means to be a man and a woman, if you had said that children in America would be undergoing sex changes, children and minors, having radical mastectomies, having orchiectomies, having their testicles removed, if you had said that schools would develop policies to deceive parents about their children's gender identity, and even that some U.S. states would have laws allowing the governments to seize gender nonconforming minors from their parents so they could undergo chemical and surgical mutilation of their bodies, if you had said any of this, you would have been denounced as an alarmist, as a bigot, as a homophobe, as a transphobe, and worst of all, a fundamentalist. And yet it all came true. The fundamentalists, and I'm not a fundamentalist, but we got to give them their due, they were right. Well, think about it. In 6 or 7 states in this country today, the government can take children away from their families and surgically or chemically alter their bodies in an attempt to change their sex. And we all just shrug and accept it. It really is a kind of apocalypse. Living in Hungary, where I do, where people find this stuff incomprehensible, they think it can never come here, I tell them the same thing. I'm like, do you realize this happens in America? Do you realize the government can take minors in certain states, 15 years of age, who are still minors, away from their parents if they want to be transitioned, and the parents have no say in it? They can't believe it, the Hungarians are like, you have lost your minds. I'm like, yeah, we would have thought that 20 years ago in America. If you had told me that this would have happened, that this was coming, I would have said it'll never happen because people will be in the streets protesting the government. Now, as I said, we just shrug. And you know what? You don't need to affirm the existence of God in order to reject your ideology and the soft totalitarian system that compels us to bow a knee to it. Nevertheless, there is a core religious aspect to this crisis. In his 1983 Templeton lecture, Solzhenitsyn said this, quote, "More than half a century ago, while still a child, I heard several older people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Since then, I have spent well nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I've read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own toward the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened." Well, my friends, if Western civilization remembered God, the anthropological nightmare of gender ideology and what it's doing to individuals and children and families would not be a reality. But we in the West began to forget God in the 18th century in the Enlightenment, and now the collective loss of memory of God, what Nietzsche called the death of God, is nearing completion. Now, to be sure, there are many millions who still affirm God's existence. But for so many of these people, it's not really the God of the Bible. It's the vague, sentimental God of what has been called moralistic therapeutic deism. It's a God who has been domesticated and forced to fit into a warm, fuzzy, humanly defined mold. A God who wants little more from us than that we be nice and that we be happy. This week, just down the road from us tonight at Baylor, an English professor who holds an endowed chair, a guy named Greg Garrett, said on Twitter that he taught his Harry Potter class, about how wicked J.K. Rowling is for her, quote, hatred of trans people. When criticized, the professor said that, well, this is what Jesus would have done. Many Christian institutions have been lost, and many more are barely holding on. Without most of us realizing what has happened, the old Christian cosmology has been replaced by a new cosmology. A cosmology is a vision that tells you how the universe is structured, what it means to be human, and all the ways of the world. The old Christian cosmology has been hollowed out and transformed into an anti-Christian cosmology based on humanity's subjective desires. And so, as Solzhenitsyn wrote, quote, "Little by little, we've fallen out of sync with the rhythm and the breath of nature, of the universe." Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. To resist this evil cosmology that seeks to conquer us all through totalitarian methods requires the courage to accept the truth and the willingness to suffer for the sake of the truth. It requires refusing the language of lies and committing ourselves to communal ways of speaking and acting that keeps the memories of that reality alive. One of the most amazing things I learned by interviewing anti-communist dissidents in Eastern Europe and Russia is that none of them expected to live to see the end of communism. They resisted at great personal cost because it was the right thing to do, because they wanted to keep the memory of what it meant to live in truth alive and pass it on to the next generations so that the memory of truth, the reality of truth, could stay alive until the totalitarian monster finally died. Truth, courage, including the courage to accept suffering, and cultural memory, these are the most powerful weapons against totalitarianism. And the greatest of these is cultural memory. And the most important thing to remember, not just in our personal memories, but in the life of our communities and the life of our culture, is the memory of God. Thank you very much for listening. We're gonna have some Q&A tonight, but I really hope that for our first respondent, I want to ask Soren to speak. Soren, if you haven't met her yet, has an extraordinary story to tell. She's a detransitioner and has spoken out bravely in the state legislature about what's being done to minors by this ideology. And I just would like, she had no idea what I was going to say tonight. I would love to get her response. And feel free to criticize if you like, but people need to know what you've been through. Do you feel okay to speak?
Yeah, that's totally fine. I wasn't expecting it. I thought you were joking earlier when you brought it up.
I don't play.
No, that's fine. You seem very serious. My name is Soren. I've spoken to some of you guys this weekend. I'm a detransitioner. I transitioned for about 8 years between the ages of 11 and age 19. I started identifying as transgender when I was 11 through the internet, started testosterone at 17, and then at age 19 had a double mastectomy that almost killed me. About 6 months after that, I originally stopped taking the meds, and then the ideological detransition came afterward. And so it's actually been really refreshing to hear what you spoke about tonight, because I go to UT Austin. I'm a fourth year there, and I study how the internet's influencing identity formation. And I find myself censoring myself a lot because I do kind of stand in this space between the left and the right, where I have this very liberal lived experience, but obviously a very unorthodox opinion as far as being a liberal goes. And it's really interesting because I've always sort of had this card I can pull when I talk about this issue. Like, hey, I'm detrans. Like, you can't tell me that this isn't my feelings on the subject because I've literally sacrificed parts of my body to the altar of gender. That said, I recently put on a panel in a group of mine. It's called Bridge USA, is the parent organization. And the whole idea behind Bridge USA is we bridge the gap between the left and the right. We have hard conversations. We don't shy away from disagreement. We lean into it. And I put together a panel on gender and sex. And it was beautiful. We had 2 detransition people, 2 transgender people, and then a boring old lesbian. And everyone on the panel was very gracious about it. They were like, I disagree with you, and I love you. There were hugs. They were happy tears. Like, it was beautiful, genuinely. And then I found out someone had been recording the panel from the audience and sent it to the other detransitioned gentleman's peers in an effort to get him canceled. And fortunately, this was my first time meeting the guy. We became close friends. Like, we became great friends after that because we had this lived experience. But even at a state university here in Texas, this is so real. This desire to shut down dialogue, even when there were transgender participants on the panel who had no issue. It's appalling. It really is. Because I guess from my perspective, yeah, I was pretty totalitarian myself. I was very activist minded. I wanted people to accept my point of view because I thought my point of view is the world. But I think today, I'm 21 now. I'm 2 years out from detransitioning. I love talking to people who disagree with me. I love talking to people who have a different lived experience than me. And it's really frustrating to me to hear the things that you've shared. Not you that's frustrated me, but the fact that other people aren't tolerant. The party of tolerance and kindness isn't tolerant enough to have hard discussions about what's going on and about things that are so materially true. Like, it wasn't real for me until it almost killed me. And I don't think people should have to go through the 7 levels of hell in order to understand that sex is real. Maybe the things attached to sex, like our cultural practices, maybe those are constructed. They're still evolutionarily based for the most part, but they're constructed. But sex itself is not. And so I've really appreciated you standing up there today, giving me sort of a platform to share that. But this is a conversation that needs to be had, and it's amazing to meet you, Rod. Thank you.
Soren, can you talk a little bit about this amazing conversation you and I had today about the pressure that fell into your mother to yield to your transition? Yeah. I don't want to make you say something that's too private.
No, it's fine.
But no, it's so significant because I'll tell you where I'm coming from. A few years ago, before this stuff really got underway, I was visiting a friend of mine at her church in suburban Baltimore, and I talked to a woman in the church who had read my stuff, and she told me that she was terrified for her daughter, who was a senior at a public high school there, because transgenderism was a big thing. Her daughter was slightly on the spectrum, and she was being pressured heavily into defining herself as male. And the woman, she worked for the NSA. She's really intelligent and all that, but she said the worst bullies are the other parents of transition because they are, and she couldn't figure out why. She theorized that because they needed to be affirmed in their choice to allow their child to transition, so they tried, really aggressively to shut down any dissent. Is this something that resonates with your experience?
No, it absolutely does. That's really interesting.
Do you want to come up here, or do you want?
No, I'm good. I'm good standing where I'm at. Thank you, though. No, that's very true. So actually, around the time that my mom discovered my transgender identity, we started going to a support group here in Fort Worth, Texas, actually, like maybe 30 minutes away from here. And in the support group, there were 3 levels. There was the transgender adults, the loved ones of the family members, and the transgender youth. My mom tried attending the loved ones group, and in the group, she remembered people were exactly like you described. Like, people, especially those with younger children, had a very fixed idea on how the parent should respond. I remember this one friend of mine, male, his family was very traditional, real quiet father, lived in Burleson, of all places. And I remember his family was initially very against medical transition, but throughout the course of them being in this group, eventually came to endorse hormones for their child, moved their child to a whole separate state in order to pursue a new life for their child. And as for my mom, like a couple years later, and I will totally admit to it, like, me and other family members of mine ended up bullying her with that sort of dead daughter, living son rhetoric into signing off on the hormones for me. That's why I started underage, not because my mom was okay with it. She actually asked me to keep her participation in it under the table, away from other family members, but because she was afraid of losing me. Whether that was in material, like me dying, me ending my own life, or in the ideal of me cutting her off, of me denouncing her, which I did. I mean, fortunately, in many ways, the COVID-19 pandemic and the way that our country responded to it coincided with me starting these hormones. I started them in January of 2020, and we know what happened by March, right? So I guess to that regard, I didn't make the choice to cut her off. I had some time to cool down. I got trapped in Oklahoma, of all places. And that, I think that distance actually did a great deal of good, because now she's like my best friend. Like, her and I are so chill. She tries to apologize all the time, but I'm like, Mom, I was a bully. Like, I understand the grace that you're giving me, and I understand that grace that I gave you, but she really was pressured to give in or else lose her child. And who wants to lose their child? Like, that's just so profound to me. So.
Do you think this is totalitarian, though, in the ways I've described, or did I get something wrong?
No, I think you're right. It's always difficult to say that, because, I mean, even now, even though I'm so confident in myself, I have a job I'm not afraid to lose. Like, I get afraid of agreeing, but I do agree. I do think that fear speaks for itself. Even me, surrounded by people. I have a lawsuit here in Texas, in Tarrant County, regarding my gender transition. Like, I have the world behind me. And at the same time, it's something that is so difficult to speak up on, because there is this cultural push to shut down dissent in a way that I think is largely evident of where our culture is across the board. Like, in any subject, we can't talk about abortion. I remember even in the group that I love, we had some debate over, like, what topics are we actually willing to encounter. And I remember us saying, we're not going to touch abortion, we're not going to touch religion. And some members had a great deal to say about that, because the group that I'm in, that should be the group of all groups we're allowed to talk about it. But I think there is so much to be said about this sort of polarization we're seeing. And I think that the transgender issue, in being something that is the whole, I mean, reproduction is the reason every single one of us are in this room today, right? It is the thing that we should be able to agree on, because it is literally the reason we're here. And yet, that polarization infects even that obvious of a truth. So obviously it's infected every area of society other than that. And I'm really grateful to be in a space where we can have that conversation, but you're absolutely right. It's not a conversation you can have most places.
Well, I really appreciate your courage and coming here to be with us. You're not even you're conservative, but
I'm pretty moderate, but I have more and more conservative friends as time goes on.
No, but I appreciate you be willing to come here, because one of the things I learned, I was telling Soren this earlier, when I went to Eastern Europe to interview those who stayed behind and resisted the communists, they said that one of the things you absolutely need when you're standing against totalitarianism is allies. And you can't afford to be fussy, because to resist something that's truly totalitarian requires immense courage, because they can take your job away. And in a real totalitarian society, a hard one, they can put you in prison. We don't have that here, thank God, yet. But they can ruin your career and make your life hell. So you need allies. And these people I talked to were all Christians, but they said that, we couldn't afford to only make Christian allies. And this one woman in particular I talked to, Camilla Bendova, she is from this amazing Catholic family. She and her husband were at the center of the anti-communist resistance in Czechoslovakia, in what is now the Czech Republic. The Czech Republic is primarily a secular place. They were the Benda family were the only Christians in that resistance, which was led by Václav Havel, who became the first president of a free Czechoslovakia. But Camilla told me, she said, my husband and I knew that we couldn't count on other Christians. They were Catholics, but she said most of the Catholics we knew kept their heads down, didn't want to cause trouble. They were cowards. And you could understand why they were, because you really had to put your neck out. But she said, my husband and I knew that it was these secular people, secular leftists like Havel and others, other great figures, who could be counted on to risk their freedom and even their lives to defend the truth. Camilla told me that, we knew that if one of us got sent to prison, we could count on them to raise our kids, and they knew they could count on us. And she told me, and she was just the most forceful, but I heard the same thing from people over and over and over, that look for people who don't necessarily agree with you on everything, but on the most important things, like the sanctity of free speech and freedom of expression, stand with them. I was telling Soren earlier today that when my book Live Not by Lies came out in 2020, one of the earliest advocates of the book was Barry Weiss, who is she's probably center-left or moderate, centrist, lesbian, married to a woman, not the sort of person who would ever who would agree with me or who I would agree with on a lot of things. But we agreed on this issue, and Barry laughed and said, if you had told me 2 years ago I would agree with Rod Dreher on anything, I would have laughed at you, but here we are. I'm like, yeah, I know, here we are. Because whatever our differences, we agree that the threat to our liberties to say what we believe is true, which undergirds so many other liberties, this is fundamentally at risk, and we have so much more in common than either of us do with people maybe on our own side who don't share our views. So let me leave that with you tonight, that always remember, look for allies and don't have a purity test, because you need those who are willing to be courageous when put to the test. Who has a question? More.
My name is Jenny from the University of St. Thomas out of Houston. I guess my question is more so, I know a lot of people here probably don't have kids, but I have kids. I have 2 kids, and they're very small. They're 3 and 1. And I guess, what can I do as a mom, and a young mom at that, to protect their exposure? Mm-hmm. Because I know it's really hard right now. Like many people have said, the internet, it's everywhere, and we can control them not having a smartphone or an iPad or whatever, but we can't control the other people they're around. Like, would you suggest homeschooling or something as drastic as moving out of the country, or like, what do you think is the best solution to that? Yeah, no, that's a question that every parent, if they're not asking themselves now, they will be. Every one of you who don't have kids, you're going to be asking yourself this one day. And there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. I mean, obviously, no smartphones, no access to the internet, but it's also the case that just ordinary kids programming is so suffused with culturally provocative and liberal propaganda. I remember summer of 2021, when I was in Budapest, I had to go at a scheduled meeting with the family minister. There's a government ministry dealing with families. And she was late that day, and she said, I'm really sorry, but we had a meeting with the Prime Minister today. He said, we're going to announce legislation in Parliament that will ban LGBT material for minors. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Have you heard of the Blues Clues Pride Parade? He said, no, what's that? And I told them, how many people here know about the Blues Clues Pride Parade? Okay, not everybody. You know, Blues Clues is something my kids were raised on. My kids are older, but like in the early 2000s, they were raised on this. Blues Clues is just such a sweet, wonderful little cartoon. It's gotten super woke. And I pulled out my phone and showed all these Hungarians, and these aren't people who just fell off the turnip truck. These are government ministers and aides. This video from Blues Clues, this kids show, showing a cartoon drag queen singing a marching song about a pride parade that had all the different rainbow families. They even had a transgender family where one of the kids had scars from having her breasts removed. And for like 4 or 5-year-old kids, all these Hungarians, like their jaws were on the table. I said, this is common in America now. This is what you're preventing. And it really galvanized them because they had nothing but criticism from other people in Europe. But I was trying to explain to them, this is the kind of thing that even if you won't let your kids watch it, other people's are letting their kids watch it. So I guess because you can't, to go back to your question, if you can't, well, let me back up a little. You want to make sure that it's not just the internet. It can be ordinary network and cable programming that you might remember from your own childhood was normal. It ain't anymore. You got to pay attention to that. More than that, it's not enough to keep your kids away from things. You've got to help build the resilience up inside them. I remember how proud I was of my daughter when she was younger. You know, we thought she was old enough to see a certain thing, you know, because we didn't want to like super shelter them. We just wanted to show them things that were age appropriate and help them be able to make the decisions themselves to turn away from it.
I remember I don't know even what it was, but we set her in front of the TV and said, you can watch this. After a couple minutes, she came out and said, I'm not ready for that. And I'm like, oh, yes, victory. Because it would have been fine if she watched that as far as her mom and I were concerned, but the fact that she was willing to be watchful and to say, no, I'm not ready for that, that was a victory. So that's one of the great things you can do for your kids, is teach them how to be. You have to make the decision early on for them, but what you're aiming to do is to give them the internal strength and the awareness to make the decision themselves. But there is I wish I could say there was a geographical cure, move out of the country. How about moving to Slovenia? You know, that story I told, I really felt so sorry for this man, because Slovenia is just the most peaceful, gentle country. And this poor man, who was not much younger than I am, it never occurred to him that his daughter in this sweet little country with its simple little school with country kids, that she was vulnerable to these predatory teenagers in America. That's the world, you know.
Hi, I'm Emma Shatanis. I'm going to the University of Austin, which Barry Weiss founded. So what really bothers me during Christmas time is when I see happy holidays. And also when I do this myself, and I think this is just slipped into regular speech, but when you characterize someone that you don't know the gender of as they, or like you talk about a kid does this and they will do that. And I was wondering, and I know Matt Walsh has said, oh, don't say anything about happy holidays, that's fine. Conservatives make such a bugaboo about it. My dad thinks it's not to worry about. But I think that it's kind of just, maybe we shouldn't make a whole tantrum, but thing about it. But I think it's a sign of cultural rot, and a sign that like things are turning bad, that it's happy holidays in a Christian country.
Yeah, well, sadly, I don't think we're a Christian country anymore. I think a majority of people identify with Christianity, but because of the sort of thing you're talking about, I think that we're not meaningfully Christian. Now, that is not a reason for we who are Christians to back down on that. And I do say Merry Christmas. I mean, I don't do it to be provocative, to like, if I know somebody is Jewish or not a believer, I'm not going to say Merry Christmas. You know, that's stupid. You know, you don't win people over that way. But, you know, I've been in Israel during Jewish holidays, and people not knowing that you're not Jewish will wish you, happy Purim or whatever. I'm fine with that. I don't care. I used to live in a heavily Muslim neighborhood in Brooklyn, and people, if Muslims would sell me on the street and wish me a happy Ramadan or whatever, fine. They're wishing me the best. That's what real tolerance is. But I expect the same sort of treatment. So I'm like you. I don't think we ought to go out of our way to be culturally aggressive and insulting to other people. But at the same time, just be normal and natural and say what you think, because you don't have anything to be ashamed of. But it's certain people, especially the very online people. I mean, I'm an Orthodox Christian, Eastern Orthodox Christian, and I was talking with somebody here today about the so-called ortho bros. You have traditional Catholics who are the same way, and some of the Calvinists, almost always young men, and they're so aggressive. It's like, jerkiness is next to godliness. And like, who does that win over? Because it's not the same as courage. It's one thing, we are called to be courageous in our witness and not to deny who we are, but that does not give us license to get up in people's faces and be rude about it. And so it calls for discernment and wisdom and simple courtesy. That's all it takes. I remember when I had a friend from up north come to visit me down in Louisiana when I was living, and she got really flustered when waitresses would call her baby, and they don't mean anything by it. That's just a way of showing that they care about you. And I would explain to my friend that when I moved to New York City, I had to really get accustomed, had to code switch, and learn that things were different there. And they weren't trying to be rude to me necessarily. They were just, that's how they are. And I think that we can go so far with just giving people grace. but also expecting to be given grace and not to feel like we have to apologize for who we are. You know, I don't want people to feel like if you're Muslim, if you're Jewish, if you're not a believer, I don't want you to have to apologize to me. I want to respect you for who you are, but I expect the same treatment.
Hello, Mr. Dreher. Zach of UT Austin. All right, so you say in your talk we should resist the gender ideology, right? So in doing so, you are advocating an embrace of reality, which involves an embracing of human nature. So I have a kind of question that seeks to generalize this. It seems like there's a principle here of resistance to a kind of technological domination that seeks to unduly manipulate human nature. So what I'm wondering is, how far do we go in resistance to this regime of technological domination, specifically in its form, in the forms that it takes in like the therapeutic kind of culture of psychiatry and manipulating the human nature through manipulating kind of serotonin states and et cetera through medication, right? So manipulating human nature in that way, and then manipulating human nature in the form of birth control, et cetera. So like, it seems like we have these technologies through which we can really alter the human condition. And I'm wondering if we can generalize or abstract a principle here where actually we need to take a principled resistance to undue manipulation in all these forms, trans, birth control, and psychiatry, but that seems really extreme. So, but but it would be principled, so I'm wondering what you think about that.
You're a Weasley philosophy student, aren't you? Look, I mean, it's actually a good question. And I'm not a Luddite, you know, and I believe that a good general principle is that we should not be afraid to use technology to reduce suffering. I mean, I like dental anesthesia too. That doesn't really challenge human nature, does it? I mean, we've all known people who suffer from physical or mental anxiety or suffering, and there's no reason why they should suffer, you know, for the sake of making a point about living naturally. On the other hand, we have to use prudence and wisdom here, exercise that. I mean, there's something deeply wrong with taking a child, a prepubescent child, and putting them on puberty blockers. You know, that is a matter of contradicting nature in a way that is irreversible, no matter what they say. It's now, just today I saw there's a new study showing that the testicles of prepubescent boys do not recover from this. But that is to me the human equivalent of trying to reverse the rivers versus, say, divert rivers to make a dam or to make a mill or something like that. And I don't know that it's possible to come up with a one-size-fits-all proposition there, but I think we just have to submit it to a practical test, a common sense test about, is this serving to enhance human nature, enhance the given, or to improve lives without doing undue damage to human nature or to the given world? I mean, look, there's lots of things that we can do with technology to master the world, but should we do them? You know, and there's a guy that I'm really interested in. How many people here have heard of Ian McGilchrist? He's somebody you should know about. He's a Scottish psychiatrist who wrote a book that came out in 2009 called The Master and His Emissary. He came out with a much thicker book, like 1,500 pages, a couple of years ago, called The Matter with Things. It's much more metaphysical. But Gilchrist's basic argument is that culture is defined by brain hemispheres. The left hemisphere is more abstract and logical. The right hemisphere is much more tactile and emotional. And his is not a simplistic thing, you're either left brain or right brain. He said in a healthy human brain, they all work together. But he said in the West, since around the time of the Reformation and the scientific revolution, we have gone towards favoring in the West the left brain, the analytical side, because it allows us to have more power over nature and and we can accomplish great things there. but ultimately it divorces us from reality. We become too abstracted from reality of the kind that the right brain is able to perceive. And so what McGilchrist says is that he doesn't come up with this grand formula for this is how we're going to fix it. That's a very left brain sort of thing to do. But he says we just need more prudence. We need to get out of our heads and live more in the real world. I was talking to Soren earlier today. I don't think it's any coincidence at all that this radical increase in gender fluidity has occurred in the generation, your generation, that was the first one to be raised on the internet. Because what does the internet do? And I'm guilty of this too. I live on the internet. This is how I make my living. But I live in my head all the time, I have become so much more sedentary since I became a work-at-home writer, right? But the internet allows you or conditions your mind without even realizing what's happening, conditions you to think of the world as living inside your head. It's existing inside your head. And you don't tend to think about what it means to be an embodied person if you're spending so much time online. And this is not an evil conspiracy. It's just the way the medium works. There's a great book by Matthew Crawford, a popular philosopher. It's called The World Outside Your Head. And he talks about that, about how we are in real danger of losing fundamental contact with reality, with embodied reality, because we spend so much time on our devices. Crawford says, and McGilchrist agrees, that attention is what makes us who we are. It's one of the things that makes us at least who we are. What we choose to attend to is what tells us what is real. And if we're giving so much of our attention over to being passive receivers of what creators online, whether it's creators of pornography, of news, of anime, of anything, it is unavoidably going to shape our sense of reality. And we just have to exercise more agency there and quit being so passive. Check this book out. It's The World Outside Your Head, I think it's called. I have a book coming out in the fall called Living in Wonder that makes use of what McGilchrist said and what Crawford said, talking about how the disenchantment of the world has a lot to do with our loss of a sense of our embodiment in the world and our loss of an ability to focus attention. There's a guy, a German sociologist named Hartmut Rosa, not a religious believer as far as I know, but he has this idea, this concept called resonance. And this is, I think, and you can exchange this word for enchantment in the sense that Max Weber meant. Rosa says that when you feel a sense of resonance with the world outside your head, you feel like you live in a world of purpose. It is a world where you fit and you feel like you have something to do in that world. You relate to the world outside you. If when you come in contact with the phenomenon, if you don't have any contact with it, you can't resonate with it. But when you come in contact with it, if you live in some sort of mysterious communion with it, that sounds kind of woo-woo, but he's not using metaphysical language. He's just saying that, like if you see a painting or a beautiful forest or another person that you really like, if you establish some sense of communion, a sense of relationship with them, they can be enchanting. There's a sense of mystery there that it beckons you into closer relationship. But if you seek to dominate, to establish total control over this person, place, or thing, you will disenchant them. Because the only way a thing can be enchanted, can seem magical, or can seem to have some deeper sense of resonance with you, is if you don't fully control it. This is the problem with the modern world. We are predicated on this constant drive to bring everything under man's control. So we evacuate a sense of mystery and meaning from the world rather than seek to live with it and to live in harmony with it. And it's certainly true about our sexed bodies. You know, it causes us anxiety. I mean, no, if you've ever been, if you've ever been through puberty, and I know you all have, you know how anxious it makes you. I thank God that I went through puberty in a time before the internet because it was hard, it was scary, it was freaky, and my parents, you couldn't talk to them about it. They didn't want to know anything. I had to kind of go through it alone. Now, if I'd had the internet there with no guidance, I would have, God knows what would have happened. I mean, and this is what your generation, I'm telling you this, you had to do it, you know, but it's a sort of thing that our civilization and my generation seems somehow afraid to give your generation any real guidance on. And perhaps, too, some in your generation don't want to receive guidance because so many of us, of my generation, are so clueless about it. I really don't know the way through this, but I do know this, that if we surrender ourselves to the machine, capital M machine, be the internet being the primary exponent of the machine, we're doomed. There's a guy named Paul Kingsnorth. You really should read him. He writes a Substack called The Abbey of Misrule. He's an Irish novelist. He was a recent convert to Christianity, but he's in his 50s. For most of his life, he was a secularist, environmentalist, and then a pagan for a while. But he writes very beautifully about the machine and how it is, how technological society has set itself up as an enemy of human nature and of human liberty. And Paul he's really rising as a thinker. He's going to have a book published either later this year or early next in this country. But he's somebody definitely to pay attention to because he's not a religious nut. He's a religious man, not a religious nut. He's somebody who's been seeing this rise for a while. And this manic desire to control, we are strip mining human bodies and human nature in order to establish control over it, and we are destroying the capacity for authentic human life. Anyway, gosh, I'm cheerful, aren't I?
Hello, my name is Heike. I go to the Baylor University, so
hello.
I'm very familiar with that story that you mentioned. Considering where we are regarding just like being able to express dissenting beliefs on transgenderism and all of these things that are happening, and how it is seeping into schools like Baylor, even if it's small right now, and people are leaving the places that these totalitarian ideals are rising, like in my home state, California. I mean, do you genuinely believe that there is a possibility that we could even go back, maybe not back, but go to a time or be in a place where we can freely exchange without the fear of maybe not suffering, but like persecution of these ideas and having dissenting beliefs? It just seems like that time has passed and that it may never come back. But
Oh, no. Have you ever heard of the social credit system in China? That's what we're talking about here. In China, as most of you may have heard about this, but I'll just very briefly say, in China, almost all of the economic exchanges are electronic. It's an almost fully cashless society, and that's what they're aiming at, it's very convenient. The thing is, if the government monitors everything you do, all of your activity online. It has the capacity technologically to know where you've been through facial recognition software, and they don't even require human beings to monitor this. The computers will track you, and if you're at a place and you've been tagged, if you're at a place when you shouldn't be, the computer will mark it and take your social credit score and move it down. Again, with no human being ever actually seeing it, this happens automatically. The lower your social credit score, the less freedom you have to move around. You can't travel as much. You have fewer privileges. The higher your social credit score, which is to say the more you conform to what the government expects from you, it makes you a good citizen, the more privileges you have. One of the things that takes your social credit score down is going to church. And if it gets low enough, And by the way, socializing with other people who have lower social credit scores also brings you down. So everyone is incentivized to shun those who are dissidents. If it gets low enough, you can't buy or sell. Now, if you're a Christian who knows about the book of Revelation, the prophecy that the day is going to come when you can't buy or sell unless you take the mark of the beast, I remember reading that when I was younger and thinking, how in the world would that work? Well, guess what? It's happening in China now. They don't have an actual mark on you, but they have the technological capability to do this. You think, well, that's China. What about us? There's a great book that came out a few years ago called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by a woman named Shoshana Zuboff. She was a Harvard Business School professor who wrote about how we have built the same kind of system into our capitalist structures. She talks about, for example, this book came out 2, maybe 3 years ago. I don't know how far the technology has gone. But at the time she wrote the book, they were developing a television that could measure the facial reactions of people watching it when they saw certain commercials or certain TV shows and report back to the central database. This was all about figuring out how to sell people things. It doesn't take a genius to figure out how this can be used politically, to punish people who are watching TV and who have a negative reaction to some commercial or some show or some political speech. It gets noted as part of your social credit score. Right now in Scotland, they just passed a law. It went into effect April 1st, a hate speech law that basically makes it open season on free speech. J.K. Rowling, to her very great credit, she's on the left politically, but she stood up openly for women. She said, I support transgender people. They should not be mistreated. They should be, have the same rights as others, but they shouldn't be in women-only spaces, and women shouldn't suffer for that. J.K. Rowling, by rights, ought to be prosecuted by the government for hate speech under these new laws. And she said, basically, when this went into effect, she said, come and get me. Well, they don't dare do it because she's J.K. Rowling. And she also must know that if the government decides to come after lower-level people for these ridiculous offenses, that it'll be obvious that they went after the lower-level people because they weren't famous and rich. So J.K. Rowling wins anyway. My point simply is this, that this is happening already in the West. And, we in the United States are really lucky that we have the First Amendment that's going to protect us from a lot of this stuff. But at the same time, there's a lot you can do that with soft totalitarianism. It doesn't have to involve the government. That somebody doesn't have to hire you if they think that you would be a bad fit for their business because of some public position you've taken. It's a free country. They're not forced to hire you. So, but you have to be careful because, as you've no doubt been told, that your social media history is there forever. And future employers, they'd be stupid not to Google and see what they can find out about you. You may never know that you've not been hired. I've had academics tell me who've been sitting in on hiring sessions in their department at their colleges who said that there's been open discrimination against religious believers and people who are perceived to be conservative. Even people who will say they're liberal, but they're not liberal enough, and nobody ever knows this. So this is the sort of thing that a lot can happen without any formal legal discrimination. But the social credit system in the age of surveillance capitalism is something that really troubles me. I remember when COVID started, suddenly, and this was everywhere, but it was certainly in my city where I was living in Baton Rouge, suddenly there were signs everywhere saying, no change, use your card. What do you mean no coins? What kind of shortage of coins? I didn't believe it, but what choice do you have? You had to use your card. What that did was compel everybody to get used to using your card. Super convenient. I live in Budapest now. Everybody uses their cards for everything. It's great. But there's a record now of every transaction you make, every single one. So if somebody somewhere has a record of every time I've used that card to buy a movie on Amazon streaming, or to go to the movies, or go to a bookstore, whatever, It's recorded. And one day, that could be weaponized. That's the sort of thing that I fear. And if you can convince people, that it's for our own safety, that we have to silence these people, we have to punish them so everyone can feel safe. Boy, people will yield to that. We saw it, we all know the story of McCarthyism in the 50s. Human nature hasn't changed. I can remember, I go back in early part of this century, I was living in New York on 9/11. I was standing on the Brooklyn Bridge as a reporter when the first tower came down. I saw it with my own eyes. And my wife back home in Brooklyn thought I was dead until I came back home covered in dust. And it shook us up so bad. Everybody in the city was so traumatic. So when the time came when the US government started talking about Iraq was behind this, and we better go after Iraq, or the next, we'll see a mushroom cloud over American cities and all that, I was primed to believe it. I remember there were people, even on my own conservative side, Patrick Buchanan, for example, and Robert Novak, said, wait a minute, where's the evidence here? I was so angry at them. I'm like, don't you see we have to go to war? Well, the war ended up being a complete disaster. And I reflected back on how I allowed myself, without knowing what I was doing, I thought I was being high-minded and saying, well, we have to protect America and blah, blah, and spread democracy and all that. In fact, I just wanted some Muslims to get bombed to pay the price for what had happened to us in New York. I was ashamed of it. I am ashamed of that. But I concealed that base desire within patriotic rhetoric and allowed the government to scare me into supporting something I shouldn't have supported. Now, I don't want to start an argument about the Iraq war tonight. I'm just simply using that as an example where I thought I was being very clear. We have to be in favor of this war. And in fact, my motives were really not what I thought they were. And that's just human nature. This happens all the time. This is the sort of thing I worry about, though, that if people in power, whether it's a government or a university or the media or the military, anybody else, manipulates people's fear into doing things that they shouldn't do, this is a perennial threat. And it's especially true when we are in a society in which we're trained to think that any anxiety is bad. I'll tell you a true story that's really freaky. A few years ago, back in 2018, a friend of mine, a European journalist, was at Harvard for a year. They do this thing at Harvard called Nieman Fellowships. Every year they give 100 of them out, 50 to American mid-career journalists and 50 to foreign journalists. You get to come spend a year at Harvard taking graduate courses. Well, a friend of mine from Europe did the Nieman Fellowship and got to toward the end when he was getting ready to go back to Europe after his fellowship was over. I happened to be in Boston on business, so I invited him to lunch just to ask him, what did you learn at America's most prestigious university? And he thought about it. He said, I learned how fragile America's elites are. I said, huh? What do you mean? He said, when we got here to Harvard, we're all excited. Harvard's America's top university and all that. Clearly, he hadn't been to LSU, but, well, bless his heart, we'll give him that. But he said that, we went to class, and on the first day of class, one of the professors said, class, today we're going to talk about this thing, but we're going to ignore this and this aspect of it because some of you came to me ahead of time and said it would be too triggering for you to talk about it, so we won't talk about it. Well, my friend said all of us foreign students, journalists looked at each other like, is this real? Does he mean it? Yeah, he meant it. And he wasn't the only one. He said, the journalist said this happened in class after class. And he said, all of us from Europe were on the left, but we expected there to be actual debate. This is Harvard. But these American students couldn't deal with it. And he said, we finally realized that all of these students, these are America's next ruling class, that they were too afraid to deal with ideas that challenge them too much. They would have a breakdown. At the same time, they all believed that it was their right to rule. They expected to be the ruling class. My friend said, I'm going back to Italy next week. He said, but my country depends on a strong America, and that worries me because the next ruling class, they can't bear free speech. They can't bear hearing any idea that gives them anxiety. And so they're going to legislate and rule from that. That's the sort of thing that we need to watch out for. Do we have time for any more, Sebastian?
We are unfortunately out of time for questions. So let's have a round of applause for Rod Dreher.
Thank you, everybody.